I'm sure you've heard that a squared plus b squared equals c squared, but what does that really mean? This is the famous Pythagorean theorem. To give the simplest form of what it means, if you have a right triangle on a plane, the squares of the lengths of the two sides touching the right angle will add up to the square of length of the side opposite the right angle. When you first hear this, it sounds kind of absurd. What do triangles and squares have to do with each other anyway? And it feels intuitively like if someone fiddles the numbers just right or changes the measuring unit just right, it should break somehow. I mean, 3, 4, and 5 make one of the most famous triples for this theorem. So if you have a right triangle where one of the sides is 2 inches and the other is 3 inches, the last must be 5 inches. But what if we leave that very same triangle in the very same place and switch over to our metric ruler? Now 3 inches becomes 7.62 centimeters, 4 inches become 10.16 centimeters, and 5 inches become 12.7 centimeters. Even though it feels like that should break the theorem, it turns out that this works. Get your calculator and try it yourself. Mathematicians didn't get a list of every possible right triangle and measure their sides to show that this theorem works. In fact, they even say that doing that would be impossible. For example, a square with sides of 1 inch each, split from one corner to the other, will make 2 triangles, and the side in the middle will be length square root of 2, which is irrational. That means that you can't measure it in fractions of an inch. That means that no matter how precise your ruler is, you'll never be able to measure that side and get the square root of 2 inches. So instead of measuring every possible right triangle, mathematicians have figured out how numbers and lines work on a plane and shown that the rules around that mean it can't work out any other way. There are more than 300 proofs of the Pythagorean theorem. One of my favorites is the one that involves laying out 4 identical versions of the hypothetical triangle to make a square, and slicing that up in various ways. It just looks so obvious to me when you show it. I'm not so impressed by the one that Einstein and Euclid found that involves a lot of algebra. I guess I get that, but it feels like a trick to me. There's something else that I like about my favorite proof. It uses something subjective to prove something as objectively true. You see, the triangle that we start with doesn't have actual side lengths. It's kind of squishy in our heads. The lengths are anything that satisfies our criteria that it be a right triangle. We don't need to repeat the thought experiment with other triangles because we've defined the triangle as having undefined lengths. No such triangle can actually exist anywhere except in our heads. That's not how real lengths work. I'll need to briefly explain how I see subjective and objective realities to explain this. This idea isn't unique to me, but it's also not hugely popular. The typical move is to divide the world into physical and mental. Things that are physical are things you can touch, and things that are mental are things you can't. I don't find that division to be particularly useful much of the time. But there's something to it. When we measure the sides of our triangle in inches then centimeters, there's nothing in the triangle that changes. The inches or centimeters aren't a part of the triangle. They're in the ruler, and they're in us. Actually, they're all in us, but that's a much deeper conversation down its own rabbit hole for someone else to explore. For my purposes today, it is enough to say that the measurement unit isn't in the triangle, and if you want to wrongly believe that they're in the ruler, that's fine, I can work with that. Yet somehow, even though the inches or centimeters aren't in the triangle, the length of each side is in the triangle. It's easy to fall into the trap of thinking that the sides don't have length unless it's in inches or centimeters or something, but no. The length is real, and if the triangle was there before people, then the lines had lengths before there were inches or centimeters or any other measurement for them to be. And yet the length isn't really physical. Okay. So at this point I bet most of my readers have been imagining a wooden or plastic triangle, and that's going to leave them screaming at the screen that the length can be touched. Instead, imagine a triangle by 3 stars as the points, millions of light years apart in the galaxy. Now you can't touch the lengths, both because they're too big and because they're immaterial. Yet we're still all going to have the same lengths if we measure them, after we do the appropriate translation of units. So the length is objective. It's in the object, not the subject looking at the object. So there are clearly 2 types of things in what is commonly called the mental realm, which means that there are really 3 realms. Besides the physical realm, there are those non-physical things that are only there because we're thinking about them, such as inches or centimeters, and then those non-physical things that are there whether we think about them or not, such as distances. It can be very difficult to tell the two non-physical categories apart, but when you recognize there's category of non-physical things that don't rely on our thoughts, which I call metaphysical, it helps to clarify things. We can still be wrong about whether a particular thing is physical, mental, or metaphysical, but at least with those distinctions in place we can give our reasons for thinking a particular thing belongs in one of these categories. Just at the beginning of this discussion, some people would have been positioned to think that the length of any side of a triangle is physical. By this point in the conversation, I would bet dollars to donuts that if I had 30 people here discussing whether the length itself of a wooden triangle is physical or metaphysical, I could pull enough. "Oh, that's a good point." And, "Are you sure that's the best way to look at that?" kind of statements and questions to get someone to hit someone else. Mathematics is built in a world of metaphorical things represented in our individual mental worlds. There are some blurred lines between the mental and metaphysical. Can the abstract right triangle with squishy lengths ever truly be metaphysical, or is it simply a mental device? I honestly have no idea. That's worth some investigation. Be that as it may, even if that squishy triangle is metaphysical, naming the sides A, B, and C is mental, and I'm pretty sure the squares or equations that prove how they relate are all mental. Even if all of this is mental, the relationship between the sides of a right triangle on a plane is metaphysical. We know it's metaphysical because it's objectively true, whether any particular person is convinced or not. In religion, there's also a lot of difficulty in separating what's objective and what's completely in our minds. Take, as one example, the debate over the presence of Christ in the bread and wine of communion. If the memorial view is correct, then Christ's presence is entirely mental. If consubstantiation is correct, then Christ's presence is material. If transubstantiation is correct, then Christ's presence is physical. One thing to recognize is that the three options are not entirely mutually exclusive, but to wherever degree each is true, it would mean a different thing. Even if each were true in its own way, the tests for each would be different. If the only correct answer is that it is mental, then any benefit the ceremony provides will disappear when the recipient can't tell if the proper authority has done the right ritual. If it's metaphysical or physical, the benefit will be felt regardless of what the recipient knows. If it's physical, the fact will show up in some sort of chemical test or volume examination or weight examination or something of that nature. I wish I could say which it is more likely to be, but the relevant tests haven't been done. Of course, I have my suspicions based on how I read the relevant scriptures and how I see different parts of the text interacting with each other, and my general sense of how God acts. But that same data is seen by others who hold a different view from me. That alone is not enough to decide the case. I think it's time that religion started to change the attitude that has prevented us from running these tests. It's inevitable that as we run these tests, we will find things that surprise us and support our rivals. But I, for one, would rather have established tests that tell me the view of communion I have committed to is incorrect than to keep believing and teaching something that might be false. For those that are committed to their view of what happens, if they really believe it, then testing it won't be scary. Put the Eucharist under a microscope. Put it in unlabeled medicine cups at a mental ward. Do whatever it takes to evaluate what level the interaction is between us and Christ's presence. All we have to lose is our errors.